Hello and welcome to this very special conversation, a special moment for the Reuters Institute as well. This is our 12th edition of the Digital News Report, something we've been curating for many years now, 46 markets with some really, really deep insight into what's happening with audience trends, how people are consuming news, why people are not consuming news, and what they're shifting to. Increasingly over the years, we've been watching the trends and waves with what's happening with social media, and now there's a few more bits coming into that picture. Video is growing as a genre. There's platforms like TikTok and Instagram that are increasingly growing both in their importance and influence. And the relationship with news is getting perhaps much more tricky and certainly more tenuous across audiences in 6 continents. Through the next hour and some, we're going to be talking about that with special focus in this conversation on what's happening with India. As you know, TikTok has been banned since 2020 in India, but that has given rise to several other platforms like YouTube and, of course, the use of chatting apps like WhatsApp, which has been a large phenomenon in India, both in terms of sharing news and articles and discussing large news events. Let me quickly introduce my fantastic panel that's going to steer us through this conversation. Rasmus Kleis Nielsen, who is director at the Reuters Institute and will, of course, present the findings of the report. Ankur, who heads Queer Peep Media. Senthalir, who's senior editor at PARI, that looks at rural India focus. And Jahnavi Sen, who is deputy editor at The Wire. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining in this conversation. Rasmus, as first order of business, perhaps if you could take us through the large, broad findings of the report itself.
Thank you so much, Mitali, and thanks everyone for finding the time to join this panel discussion of the Reuters Institute 2023 Digital News Report. So what I thought I'd do today is to run through both some of the global trends that we see in the world's largest ongoing study of digital news and media across the world, where we cover 46 markets and 6 continents, but also highlight some of the things that, in our research at least, are sort of particular about the Indian market that everyone here works in and is familiar with. So first, a word about the underlying research and what makes this possible. So the Digital News Report is based on an online survey in the 46 markets that we cover. This means that in countries with limited internet penetration, such as India, that we'll be talking about today, this will underrepresent or not capture the habits and opinions and views of many people, in particular people who are less privileged and in different ways discriminated against. I should also stress with India in particular that the survey is of English language internet users. The respondents can also respond in Hindi if they prefer, or get the survey in Hindi. But it's not representative of the whole population in India. It's a small, but we think useful and interesting subset of the market, and perhaps one that can shed light on some of the issues that media and journalists face in India today. The report is made possible by 18 different sponsors, including media organizations such as our namesakes at Reuters, media regulators in different countries, foundations, universities, and a large grant from the Google News Initiative. So what are the key findings this year? I mean, I think really the top line is the changing platform environment. We have seen for some years across the world in all the 46 markets that we cover an ongoing development where people get news online in lots of different ways. But when we ask them, what is the main way in which you get news online? The number of people who say that going direct to a news site or app is their main way continues to decline steadily. And the number of people who rely on various forms of site door access, normally mediated by platforms, some of them very large, social media, search engines, aggregators, and the like, increases over time. Now, here, I think India is very interesting in the sense that the sample that we have responses from in India in some ways are sort of ahead of the curve in this development in a global perspective. In India, it's just 12% of our respondents who say that going direct to a news site or app is their main way of getting news online. And a vast majority, 88%, say that various forms of site door access, often mediated by platforms, including large platforms, social media, search, and aggregators, is their main way to get news online. Now, as I said, this is sort of an ongoing development across the world. We have seen a sort of a steady erosion of the strength of direct connection across all the markets we cover over the last 5 years. and a parallel increase in the importance of social media as the main way of getting news online. And again, as said, in some ways, India here is ahead of the curve, perhaps in part because of a younger population where more people have grown up with mobile and platform-first forms of media use, at least in our sample of English language internet users. Now, of course, at the same time, what social means is also changing, both in terms of the priorities and functionalities of individual platforms, but also the emergence of competitors of various sorts. So what we see across the world is that Facebook, which had a sort of a moment of having an incredibly central role in terms of news discovery back in 2016, where 42% of our respondents said that they got news while using Facebook, has seen a sort of a steady decline as the platform has changed its priorities and downranked news in favor of more content from friends and family, and perhaps also from influencers and advertisers, even as a number of other platforms are growing gradually more important. But globally, it's still important to recognize that despite being sort of much less important than it was in the past, Facebook is still incredibly important in terms of news discovery. We're looking at India specifically. The main networks when it comes to not just use in general, but use for news in India are still Facebook. 39% of our respondents in India say they get news while using Facebook. WhatsApp, as Mitali said in the intro, very important, far more important in India than most of the markets that we survey. And then YouTube, which in many markets is really becoming more and more important as a platform for news, and perhaps in the Indian context, as Mitali alluded to, may have benefited from the decision to ban TikTok, one of its big competitors in many other markets. When we look specifically at younger people here globally across the markets that we cover, what we see across the world is that younger people are really abandoning Facebook for Instagram, and in most markets where it's legal, TikTok. So this is not used for news. This is the percentage of respondents between 18 and 24 in select markets who say they've used this platform for any purpose in the past week. And you can really see in the last years that Facebook has really diminished in importance for younger people, even as Instagram has grown more important, YouTube remained very important, and of course TikTok is really growing quite rapidly in many markets. Now, the question then, of course, is what does it mean to get news on these platforms? And what we see across the world when we ask people who they pay attention to when it comes to news on these platforms, it's the case that on sort of older established platforms, whether relatively small ones like Twitter or very large ones such as Facebook and YouTube, mainstream news and journalists still play a large role in terms of who people say they pay attention to when they get news on these platforms. Not the only thing people pay attention to, but, half or nearly half on the older platforms. Whereas on the newer platforms, more visually led or video oriented, in some cases, Instagram, Snapchat, and TikTok, personalities play a much larger role, and in several cases outstrip mainstream media and journalists in terms of how many people say they pay attention to for news on these platforms. Interestingly, looking more closely at data from India, leaving aside TikTok, for the 5 relevant platforms, on all 5 of them, more respondents in India say they pay attention to politicians and political activists for news in India than they do across the global average. And on 3 out of 5 relevant platforms, more respondents in India say they pay attention to personalities than in the global sample. So a less news media and journalistically centric understanding of news amongst our respondents in India than in many other markets, again, perhaps ahead of the curve in some ways. Now, in parallel with these changes in platforms and discovery, we're also seeing in much of the world really the sort of gradual evolution of a phenomenon we've called news avoidance, where people say that they will actively, sometimes or often, avoid the news. A small number of people are what we call consistent news avoiders, say they've consumed no news at all in the last month. This is normally in most countries a few percent, in a few countries close to 10%. So not nothing, but a small number. But a much larger number of people are selective news avoiders who say that they often or sometimes actively try to avoid the news. And across the 46 markets we have data on, that number has grown from 29% in 2017 to 36% in 2023. A slight dip from last year, but still, it's more than a third of our respondents who say they actively often or sometimes try to avoid the news. And India is well above the average here, 45%. It's actually one of the highest numbers in our survey. So what does that mean then to avoid the news? There are different ways amongst our respondents that we can identify. We have some people who say that when they actively try to avoid the news, they try to avoid most sources. So these are really sort of people who are taking, if you will, it's linked to low interest in news and politics. And in a sense, it's a form of periodic avoidance where people take sort of breaks from the news and really try to avoid it at least for a day or a couple of days. For often because they're not that interested in it, but also because of the content itself. But there are other ways of doing this. There are people who sort of try to sort of be very strict with themselves and periodically try to limit how much news they consume at set times of the day. Let's say only the morning and the evening, nothing during the day, or only during the day, nothing in the evening. Turning off notifications from time to time and the like. And you have people who say they try to avoid specific topics that they find particularly depressing or off-putting. And these are people we would think of engaged in specific avoidance rather than consistent or periodic avoidance. And this is often linked to practices of self-care. These are people who feel that they're being overloaded with information that is depressing, not actionable, and perhaps even irrelevant, and that it doesn't actually do anything for them. So they're trying to manage that inflow in a way that they feel is better for their well-being. The topics that people say they're most likely to avoid across the countries we look at is the war in Ukraine, it's national politics, which in many countries is seen as sort of quite off-putting and not that actionable to get daily updates on, crime and sort of violence in society. And then in particular amongst respondents who identify as being on the political right, there is a real sort of tendency to zone out of social justice issues. We've asked the people who say they actively avoid the news what might help in terms of in being interested in the news. What are the things they're most interested in? And I think here there are a couple of things that are important to note. One is that many of our respondents, but in particular those who say they actively avoid the news, say they're quite interested in getting sort of more positive stories about things in society that work, not just things that go wrong or are terrible, but also about things that are solving problems, not just reporting about how a particular school is terrible, but perhaps also a note in that story about how other schools are perhaps better at dealing with the issue at hand. At the same time, it's also important to note that they're not that interested in constant updates on the big stories of the day, the sort of the steady drumbeat of coverage, the crayon and the sort of wire copy, if you will, is not really what these people are that interested in. And often, of course, this is what features prominently at the top of news apps and the like. So you can sort of see the disconnect here. Beyond the issue of news avoidance, another dimension of the sort of social contract, if you will, between the public and journalism is the issue of trust and how people feel that the position of journalism in society is and can be debated, the notion of media criticism, whether warranted or unwarranted. Across the world, we see in many countries a gradual decline in trust in news, but also importantly, very, very high variation. So there really isn't a single global pattern here. Some erosion, yes, including in India, where it's a 3 percentage point drop from last year. So 38% this year say they feel they can trust most news most of the time. But really, really high variation from a low level of just 19% in Greece with a big drop from an already low level last year to a steady 69% in Finland, which has remained very high and stable for a long time. So not a universal pattern here. And really, I think important to understand trust in the context that people operate in and the context that journalists operate in, where, of course, they are often under attack from the ruling dispensation and other people who have a distaste for the idea of holding power to account or seek truth and report it. And that links really, I think, to the issue of media criticism. We asked this year in the survey for the first time about whether people come across people who criticize the work of journalists and news media. The number in India is well over 60%, 62% say that they quite often or very often come across people who criticize journalists and news media. The number is, I think, interesting in itself, that it's so widespread for people to experience criticism of the practice of journalism and the news media, we can't determine whether it's warranted or unwarranted, whether it's legitimate criticism or disingenuous criticism, but it still gives a sense of the volume of this and how widespread it is in society. It's also interesting because what we find across the markets that we cover is that there is a link between the volume of media criticism and trust, whether that is because low trust leads to more criticism or because more criticism leads to low trust. We can't tell on the basis of this data, but it's interesting to see the link. And when it comes to who is criticizing the media, in most countries, it's politicians and political activists, in particular in the United States. Interestingly, in India, the figure is sort of slightly lower, 39%. And actually in India, it's friends and family that's most frequently named as the source of criticism. There are a lot of uncles out there, and they have opinions on many things, including journalism and news media, and perhaps sometimes those opinions are well-grounded and fair, and other times perhaps less so. I'll leave that for each of us to judge with our respective uncles. I'll say a few things also about the business of journalism and formats before offering a wrap-up and then opening up for a discussion with a panel to hear everybody's perspectives on this. Everybody here are keenly aware that the business of news has historically been heavily reliant on advertising. In a digital environment, that advertising increasingly goes to big platforms where advertisers feel they get low cost, high reach, and more precise targeting. So they're moving their money. And this is a serious challenge for news publishers in many markets, perhaps particularly in a market like India, where advertising is exceptionally important for the business of news historically. In part in response, more and more publishers are trying to make reader revenue work in an online environment. We don't have data on this in India because our sample, I think, is too limited, and the pay market is still in a very early stage in India. So here I'm only sharing findings from a number of countries in the global north where this market is more mature and established. And what we find is that for the third year running, there is no top line growth in the number of people who say they have paid in some form for online news. And last year, it's 17%. It's been the same the last couple of years. Some growth in Australia, but also declines in some other markets. So perhaps we see a maturation and a saturation of the pay market, even in these developed high-income countries. What we see in every market that we look at virtually is that a limited number of big upmarket national news brands are the winners in a winner-takes-most market, where they capture the large majority of online news subscriptions, whereas local publishers really struggle to make much of a dent. And many of the sort of less prominent national titles can also struggle to really make pay work for them in a market with such an abundance of free at-the-point of consumption news, and where most people might be willing to pay for one, but rarely more than one title. When we ask people about what makes them pay, it's better quality or distinctive content. It's a sense of purpose, the idea that it helped to fund good journalism is an identification with the brand of the journalist. And yes, sometimes other things, features and games, but rarely that prominent, can make subscriptions more sticky, but is not really what people have top of mind when they made a decision to pay. When we ask people who are not paying what might convince them to pay in the future, some say more valuable content. Some say they might be willing to pay for things that are ad-free. Some say cheaper, more flexible approaches might be more attractive to them. In a lot of markets, the benchmark is sort of the same as Netflix or Spotify, and it's pretty clear that a large part of the public just do not feel that an individual news subscription is worth as much to them as a Netflix or a Spotify bundle is. Bluntly, almost half of our respondents say that nothing will make them pay for online news. The value proposition isn't clear enough, and the supply of free, good enough news is abundant. Finally, just on audio and video before the wrap up. In most of the countries that we look at, when we ask people about their preferred formats for online news, it's still really about text. People say they prefer to read the news online, and a smaller number say watch or listen. But there are some interesting country differences here where markets, including the Philippines and India, with generally younger population who've grown up with mobile and platform media, there is a much larger share of people who say that they want to watch news online, and text still important, yes, but less dominant than in across the 46 markets on average. So quick recap. What we see, I think, this year in the report is a continuing shift in the platform environment with profound impacts, driven in particular by younger people who want more accessible, entertaining, and interactive formats that are more personable. We see a real issue around the social contract between journalism and much of the public, with low engagement, higher news avoidance, low trust. And this is more of a problem in many of the bigger markets and divided societies, including India. We see new subscription models that are successful for some titles, but also fragile. And we see a maturation of that market. And I think also the limitations of it, even in high-income countries. And finally, I think it's clear that while text is still incredibly important, and for most people, the main way in which they consume online news, that we are seeing that video and audio is gradually becoming more important, in particular for younger audiences and those who've grown up with mobile and platform media. So with that, I will just thank you for the opportunity to present, and I look forward to the panel discussion and the rest of the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Rasmus. I think there's a lot to unpack there. So maybe we should dive straight into it. Perhaps what we can start with doing is a large snapshot of what the three of you are seeing in terms of the news landscape. Jahnavi, we've just finished what can be considered a fairly meaty event with elections in one part of India, in Karnataka. Hotly contested, lots of political drama. What was your experience as a platform in terms of, how people were engaging with the news at that period?
First, thanks, Rasmus. That was a great presentation. A lot of the details, I think, especially on India, that weren't in the overall reports, it was really fascinating. If we start with the Karnataka elections, I think, honestly, for us, this was an exciting election because it's the first time we started something new. And actually, I'd like to talk about that a little bit because if just going back to the report, one of the things that struck me from it was the part about how the people who answered your survey, they were unhappy with all forms of news being chosen for them. So whether it was by an algorithm or by a journalist or editor. And in fact, which I found surprising, was actually slightly worse for journalists and editors. So I guess that says a lot about how we think about ourselves and how other people see it, maybe. And again, that ties back to the question of trust that you were discussing in your presentation as well. And especially in a landscape like India, I think building that trust is complicated. And while, of course, it's important for individual organizations to do it through their work and in different ways, especially if they're following different subscription models and things like that. But I think in a situation where the press freedom landscape doesn't look so great, there are both legal and political challenges to reporting and often just existing, also to funding and things like that. It really creates a space where collaborations can make so much of a difference, also in building trust. And whether that means, say, legally, whether like how you see so many different organizations have challenged the IT Act, the Information Technology Act, and what that would mean for digital media specifically, in terms of the government getting to decide what counts as fake news, only government affiliated bodies getting to do that and things like that. Or also when it comes to really putting your focus on reporting and analysis in a way that you think builds the most trust. And that was something we experimented with this time during the Karnataka elections, when because in terms of the sort of funding and resources, obviously the legacy media in India has the kind of funds that none of the organizations we work for could compete with and aren't even trying to. But there are ways to collaborate which could bring out the best of what we can do, because there are reporters who are maybe not reaching the kind of audiences that the legacy media reporters are doing, but are doing equally important work and different kinds of work. And so for the Karnataka elections, there were 5 independent news organizations who came together to do a broadcast, and it was the first time in trial, and there are many spaces for improvement in that. But I think that was it was interesting to see also from a media perspective, in terms of that being a possibility and it not having to be seen only as a competitive space, where collaboration has something not only for the organizations and for the audiences, but also maybe a role in building trust in media as a whole, rather than in individual organizations or journalists.
Thank you for that, Jahnavi. And for those that may not be aware, over the past couple of months, news organizations like The Wire, The News Minute, and Newslaundry decided to collaborate. And hence, it was a joint effort, as Jahnavi alludes to, during big events like the Karnataka elections. Ankur, you can speak, I suppose, more deeply to the issue of how people are accessing news. It's a new startup for you. It's very niche in terms of what your focus is. What has your experience been across the Indian news landscape in terms of how people are coming in and engaging with your news, and what platforms are working for you?
Right. Yeah. Thanks so much, Mitali, and for this lovely discussion. I love the presentation. Thanks, Rasmus. So I want to talk a little bit about the audience who is engaging, and I have been really interested in who makes for an audience, and particularly the marginalized, historically marginalized slice of this audience, which is what I am serving, and I am from the LGBTQ community, and Dalits, Bahujan Adivasi people, which another outlet, Mook Nayak, is serving. Then there are new ones coming out, which are serving disability community. So what I'm seeing emerging is that these outlets are serving specific communities because these communities were not served by the legacy big media historically. 20 years ago, when I was growing up in my small town in northern India, the newspaper I was getting did not have any news about LGBTQ community. Or if it had news, it was so dehumanizing that I did not want to identify with the community. Same was with the broadcast media then, 20 years ago I'm talking. Whenever I go home now, 20 years later, the media, traditional media is still not serving. The newspaper is still not talking about us. The broadcast media is still not talking about us. And because I've been talking to the community for so long, what I've been seeing is that people are looking for news with which they can relate to. There was this small bar in one of the presentations where it was about news about people like me. And that's what I have been looking for. And that's what people like me or people from other marginalized communities have been looking for. And when I was starting Queerbeat, I did a small survey to get a sense of what the LGBTQ community thinks about how the legacy mainstream media has been writing about us. More than 60% people said that they have felt that the media has been misrepresenting our identities, our issues, and our stories. Over 80% said that the news about us is repetitive and is just about the big events that are happening. For example, the same-sex marriage, because the issue is happening in the court, everybody's talking about it. There is lack of diversity of news about LGBTQ community, which in itself is pretty diverse. So this was pretty fascinating and revealing, and which is what I have been trying to work on at Queerbeat. So the idea of trust and service in some ways linked. There has been growing disenchantment that the LGBTQ community or other marginalized communities have been feeling with the mainstream media outlet, which is why now they're looking for specific content about them, which is serving them. And I talk to a lot of people from my community, whether they are journalists or not. They're not going to the mainstream media outlets because they know they're not serving us. And they're looking for this specific news, which makes them feel seen, essentially. That's what I have been avoiding too, the mainstream media, completely.
Surprise, Ankur. I wonder why what the television stations have beaming out. But you raise an important point, and let me sort of get Senthalir and Rasmus's thoughts in as well. Senthalir, Rasmus was walking through the numbers of how high news avoidance is in India. Let me ask you to sort of marry that with the point that Ankur has raised about misrepresentation. Do you think that's one of the reasons from an India perspective that's feeding into news avoidance, where people are often left feeling misrepresented or wrongly, sort of exhibited to a larger audience, and that may be feeding into their news avoidance or just completely not wanting to engage with the news?
Or not seen at all.
Not seen.
Seen at all. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Mitali, and thank you, Rasmus, for the interesting presentation. Yes, as Ankur has correctly pointed out, it is one of the main reasons why there's also news avoidance. But I would actually bring in another aspect to it, because when you talk about selective news avoidance, it's not just from the consumers as well, but also the news media. I think we also have to look into what kind of news and how we define news, how the legacy media or even the present digital media is defining news, and what is that they're avoiding. And because I've also worked in both legacy media as well as digital media, and I've a vast experience in legacy media, for them, in terms of whether it comes related to caste, only when it becomes a crime, that is newsworthy. Otherwise, even 60% of the population are in rural India, and we do not write about them as well. And it's not about social justice, or it's not about what makes news, but also in terms of economy, rural economy. So rural economy and caste, everything is linked. And even when we want to look into aspects of finances or economy, the media is avoiding the whole chunk of rural economy as well. That's why I think there are different media spaces that are coming up, which are using digital platform, YouTube, and more so in regional spaces as well, to cater to this kind of information that's already been censored by the news media, even before the consumers decide whether they have to what they want to choose. So the selection comes from the media, and what the provider itself is censoring and giving it, and then the consumers themselves have to decide. And there's also a news avoidance when it comes to the consumer. So I think I think we have to look at in a broader perspective. And I think.
Let me just ask you a quick follow-up question there, Senthalir, because, PARI has been quite different in terms of its focus and has been really staunchly looking at exactly the issues that, as you point out, mainstream media doesn't, which is rural India, which is issues of social justice. Have you, over the last year or more, had to pivot towards more video content in order to reach a broader audience? And has that been more successful? Because I know that you've really excelled in long form writing over the last many years, something that Sainath is very fond of as a medium. But have you had to also pivot to newer forms like video and platforms like YouTube, platforms like Instagram, for instance?
Yeah, we had to, because we are a digital platform without advertisement. We run without advertisement, and we are also heavily dependent on social media to reach out to the audience. And apart from the long form text reports that we publish, we are also tailoring content in terms of visual and video content to post on the Instagram, because we have a large following in Instagram as well. And there's a larger engagement when it comes to Instagram. So we are also looking to YouTube to reach out to the younger audience. And Facebook, and because we also publish in 13 different 14 including English, 14 languages, and there's a Facebook people who access Facebook who are not the younger audience but older ones, but they reach out to, they access the web through the Facebook. So I think there is, we are actually really dependent on social media when it comes to reaching out our news content. Yeah.
as are many platforms across India and other countries as well. Rasmus, if I could just bring you in on that point about news avoidance, because you've been tracking this year over year, is that something that's generally always been high in India, and have you had occasion to sort of scratch below the surface and also see what is feeding into the news avoidance different from other countries and markets?
So we don't have long-term historical data on this. It's just one of those challenges as a social scientist. If we only discover a phenomenon too late, we can't go back in time and figure out what was it really like. There is no sort of I-squared drilling for social scientists. I would say that I think the points that Ankur and Senthalir make are very important for thinking about how news avoidance might evolve over time. So in the past that Ankur describes 20 years ago, there are many communities who, with good reasons, would see that they were not being represented and respected and reflected in the news that were available to them. But they might still engage with those media because they wanted to know about what's the weather going to be like, what's on in my community, what's happening in this town or place where I live. So with a critical distance, but as a utility, still engage with that news. Now, of course, in the contemporary media environment, many people don't need to go to the news media for a lot of the utility information that helps them live their lives on a daily basis. And when they then do go to the news media and feel that these news media are not for people like me, and they're signaling every day that they're not for people like me, I think it's a very sensible to maintain some distance and zone out periodically. Then, of course, the important thing is what one does next. And I think it's just one of the very encouraging developments in an otherwise super challenging and difficult market, in particular in some political contexts, to see more and more journalists who really take seriously the idea that journalism on the whole ought to be for everybody. And that also sometimes means, adding new things to old media or launching new media that can serve underserved communities or serve communities in different ways. So I think a lot of the emotional experiences and very sensible reasons people have for selectively avoiding the news have always been there, but the environment has changed in terms of what people need, what they can get, but also creating some opportunities, I think, for new entrants that really, I think, can make a big difference for some communities.
Jahnavi and Ankur, same question to you both. And Jahnavi, maybe you can respond first and then Ankur, which is what Senthalir points to an extremely, in Facebook language, it's complicated relationship with social media, especially for Indian platforms. Jahnavi, The Wire has a large presence and exposure on YouTube. A lot of the news within The Wire are sort of personalities in themselves. That's shifted a bit to Instagram. What's the relationship been like with social media? And I say this also keeping in mind the fact that for journalists, Twitter is very big in our heads, but really it's not at all. So, what's worked for you over the last few years and what hasn't?
Yeah, I think that's so true that, for us, maybe how we see it, Twitter is where all the news happens, but really YouTube has been so much bigger for us in terms of where people engage and also discuss the videos. It's one of our most active comment sections as well, where discussion is often also, unlike Twitter, there's a real back and forth sometimes between people. And I was just thinking, from your numbers of already how India has such low direct traffic to news websites, I have a feeling that would be much lower even if you were to take other languages into account. Because like Senthalir was saying, Facebook is so big for so many regional languages, as is YouTube. There are studies about how often in India, when people want to search for, want to learn something or have a question, instead of taking it to Google, they would take it to YouTube. And so really, it's one of those, complicated is one word for it, but can't get away from type relationships where these platforms do have a lot to offer. But at the same time, of course, they are subject to their own whims. And sometimes there are changes that you can do nothing about and learn about only post facto when you see sudden dips or spikes or like the whole, like there was that time several years ago now when Facebook decided it would pivot to video, and everyone suddenly decided they also had to then pivot to video, and then Facebook changed its mind. And obviously there's no way you could know that's going to happen. So it's hard to call it a relationship because it's not really two-way at this point anymore. But the use of it, I mean, you can't understate it. It is where most of our audiences are, and so where we have to be as well.
Ankur, the war zone is WhatsApp. It's not just the uncles, it's the aunties, it's the cousins, it's all of it. What have you chosen as a platform of choice or mediums of choice to communicate the stories that you would like to?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and about which we are constantly talking to people who are engaging with us. Because, I mean, since we started, our mission is really to listen first and speak later. So we engage very actively with the community, although it's a very small one because we are new. It's very much the same that the trends that are pointed out in the report. Twitter is big in our heads. It's just mostly the journalistic, academic, or people from the NGO community are engaging and tweeting each other. So the news is just staying in the bubble. As for the community, especially younger audience and audience in the smaller towns, they are talking to us through Instagram and commenting us, sending requests, telling us what to do. I remember recently I was interviewing a trans person from a very small town in southern India. And she told me that she has grown up on the internet and read about all the, got all the resources that she needed through internet only. The local media wasn't serving us. But when I was talking to her about how she is getting her news, she said that Ankur, Twitter is toxic. And this has stayed in my mind since then. So she's not getting her news from Twitter because it's overwhelming, it's toxic, people are constantly canceling each other out, all of that is happening. But she's getting most of her news from Instagram, which is where she's finding her community engagement. So because we are new, we are just on Twitter and Instagram and would want to stay here for some time. But we do want to experiment with the WhatsApp too, because that's where a lot of people who may not be from the community, but we want to reach because we want to help improve public conversation about the community. So really reach out to a larger audience through WhatsApp. We are being constantly told on Instagram, and it's Hindi, sir, video banao, which is, sir, please make video. So that's what we are trying to figure out, if that's the best way to serve our community in a smart way. That's where we are right now.
Senthalir, how do you function in the context of, as what Rasmus points out, which is, who are people pivoting to when they're even listening to news? In India, it seems overwhelmingly politicians, political activists, personalities, a lot of whom find it convenient not to speak to the issues that you're reporting on, which is what's happening in rural India, which is what's happening with health, sanitation, the building bricks of an economy that may not be functioning as the way they have to. How do you sort of shift the news away from these large personalities that it's becoming about in India?
Right. I think the premise of PARI is that we write about the lives and livelihood of people from rural India, and so we more and more focus. It's about people, and we also also the emphasis on the language, regional languages translation is because that we reach out to them, reach out to the people we write about. So I think that's been the main focus rather than I mean we cater. We have a niche we are very focused. Like it's not about it's not about what's happening to the politicians or what's happening in Delhi, but it's about what are the aspects. Though it does, when we're talking about the lives and livelihood of people from rural India, their practices, their rituals, or everything is there is a connect to the larger aspect of the politics or the economy of the India as whole. So I think it's more also reaching out to the younger audience through we have a PARI education team that works with the students, and they also engage with the students to talk about these issues, and the students also in turn volunteer to write about these issues. So I think there is a larger focus on talking about these issues and reaching out to the younger minds and also people. But though, I mean, it's also important to say that there are people like above 30 who are also engaging in with the PARI as well. Yeah. I mean, if there's, I think I hope I've answered the question.
No, thank you. You have, and it's great to also see that there are organizations and platforms thinking about this differently on how to engage with the younger audience, which is talking to them about something in a completely different way and tenor and tone. Jahnavi, I have to ask you this because it's been a difficult year gone by for The Wire, and our report also indicates there was some loss of trust with the Meta controversy that The Wire went through. How are you thinking about it? How are you sort of rebuilding, and how important has trust become over the last year for a news organization like yours, which is often sort of put into one bracket because it is quite clear in its stance, because it is quite anti-establishment. A lot of the larger media organizations do tend to push back on a lot of your stories.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think like your report said, we knew that the events of last year would have an impact. It was on our part a very serious error, and we have given and still owe our readers serious apologies for what happened. It was not the kind of mistake we ever want to repeat, and for that, even internally, to rebuild trust, we're trying to strengthen processes, really increase our fact-checking mechanisms, and just the eyes on everything that goes through, on stricter rejection policies and things like that. So, I mean, obviously, it's essential for us to try and rebuild from what happened, and to try and gain back the trust and credibility that will be lost. And I think the only way to do that is through the work that we can try and continue to do, focus on reporting, and we don't have the kind of resources that maybe larger organizations, and the kind of pushback you mentioned that is behind that. We don't have those resources, but the ones we do, we would like to continue putting them towards reporting and sending our reporters to places where we think they're needed at the time, like Manipur right now. And yeah, it will take time, but it's definitely something that we're now thinking about, constantly looking for best practices. Sorry, yes.
Rasmus, you wanted to comment on that?
Well, I mean, I just think it's very important to be open and honest about how serious a problem it was that happened at The Wire, and I just think that's it was a very serious mistake, and it's very becoming for the organization to recognize that. I think there is a research perspective on this, which is a piece of work we've done that's separate from the digital news report, but a bigger project we have on trust in news, where one of the survey questions we ask people across the world, and in this case in India, we actually have a proper nationally representative sample, including face-to-face surveys. In India, we've found in other research that the majority of Indians don't believe that news organizations are willing to admit mistakes. And it's a very clear issue around trust. If people believe that the profession and the industry is not willing to confess and admit and open up when they have made mistakes, even as they lavish attention on other people's mistakes, that's a very serious trust problem. So that takes nothing away from the seriousness of the problem that happened at The Wire. But everybody makes mistakes, and I think there is a real question of what happens next after one makes a mistake. And I think everyone on the call can probably think of one or two or maybe more news organizations in India who are not necessarily open if they've been found to publish false or misleading material or fabricated content and the like. So again, the issue is real at The Wire, but there is also the question of what one does next.
Absolutely. And I think it's a great point to sort of wind down and maybe ask all of you in turn, because I'm conscious of time. Ankur, let me start with you. It was another interesting point that Rasmus raised about the volume of criticism and the impact on trust, and the fact that in India, it's a bit different where it's not a them versus us, but often it's the larger population that is also criticizing, what news organizations are doing quite vocally. How would you describe the environment for yourself as a journalist at this point in India?
The environment of?
Just the environment that you're functioning in, both with state pushback, if you've experienced it at all,
right,
and what's happening to the wider audience.
Right. I mean, the overall environment, I think, as everybody is talking about, I have nothing new to say, is very polarized and confused. I would add confusion there. People, I feel, are trying to figure out where to get the most authentic news or information from that's relevant to them, to their lived experiences, or what they need now at this moment in their life. And because the mainstream media that they have been accessing for so long has not been able to answer that question from them, they're turning away from it, but still figuring out where to go. And where they are going, some of them are finding answers and some of them are not. So, like, even if I am looking for some news or some relevant information, sometimes I'm left confused where to look for, or where the most authentic news or information or the story is that I need. And sometimes I just don't find it. Another point I'd like to add is that my experience, and maybe it's biased experience, is that people are looking for very specific news that serves them. And this I'm saying just by talking to my own community and other marginalized communities I actively engage with them, is that they're constantly looking for news that reflects their issues, which mainstream media doesn't. And you talked about mainstream media not admitting its mistake. I think it has been arrogant all the while, and it still is. Yeah, that's it.
Well answered. Thank you. Senthalir, same question to you with a different lens, which is that the other reality of India is, much like the UK is a very classist society, India has had a complete misrepresentation in terms of caste dynamics within newsrooms and who's choosing to tell what story. What is it like for you to be a journalist in this environment currently, both political and with the social tensions that exist?
So I think the 3 points I would like to discuss. One is first, the presence of a marginalized community in the mainstream or digital media continues to be low. I mean, there are very few journalists, especially in English media, from the marginalized sections who write in English, and I think that itself shows that we are working in a less diverse space. It's not just less diverse, it also means that we are working in a space that is not aware or conscious of our experiences, which does not have a mechanism to deal with or address the issues that we face as journalists coming from marginalized sections. As well, providing that particular space within the media continues to be a challenge. It's not just legacy medias. And more and more journalists from marginalized sections who opt to work in digital medias are working for very less pay, which is another challenge. I mean, though the legacy media is hostile, and the experiences have been really, really bad. And though they pay relatively better, and working in media spaces that digital media spaces that are relatively, open to, who are proactively also recruiting, journalists from marginalized sections. We have to work in a space that there is no, it's also in terms of finances, because we also don't have the social capital that most of the journalists who can afford to work for less pay. I think that's one of the challenges across that I see and witness across media, apart from the larger political challenges that are around. Yeah.
Jahnavi, final word with you. I know you touched upon it right at the start in terms of the amount of pushback smaller organizations tend to face, whether it is by way of policy regulation, whether it is, legal hassles that you have to then face, whether it is write out criticism and almost canceling the work that a particular news organization may do. How would you define the political environment at this point for the work that you do? And maybe I'll make it a bit more difficult for you and ask you, what gives you hope at this point in time, given everything that we're functioning with?
I think, it is a difficult situation, absolutely. And more, I think, as Senthalir was saying, there are fewer places that maybe certain voices can be expressed in, but then there are different problems there, like those of resources and pay and finances, and those are very real for journalists who are doing this as their full-time jobs. And when that comes alongside, like when you're working for not a lot of money, but you're doing it because maybe this is the journalism you believe in, but then in addition to that, you're also facing all sorts of criticisms and pushback and barriers more than anything else, even to just barriers to reporting in terms of getting information out of the government and officials. It is absolutely difficult. But I guess what gives me hope is that people are still doing it and doing it well in so many cases that we see around us. There are so many smaller organizations, like Ankur said, many of which serve niche audiences and communities that are doing such interesting and exciting things. And the challenges will continue, particularly the financial ones, probably also the political ones and the legal ones. But the fact that, somehow the value is being seen in that, both in terms of the people doing it and the people and the audiences who are looking for it, I think that is something to be hopeful about.
Indeed, we'll wind it down there, but thank you all very, very much. Thank you, Rasmus, for that presentation. I'm so glad to see that for so many news editors, there is so much value that is added from the work that we do in the digital news report, and there's so much to take away. Thank you, Jahnavi. Thank you, Ankur. Thank you, Senthalir. I think it's been a really rich discussion and lots for us to take away as well and think about. We'll wind it down now. For everyone who's been watching as well, thanks for having watched this, and we'll see you again next year. Bye-bye.